Hello everyone, this is Module 10, a presentation about the great state of New York, and there are about 30 slides. I hope you had the time to read the atlas and look at the maps, and here we go. In this module, we will discuss New York, the Empire State, the long and rich history of wine in New York. We will look at the subregions, including Long Island, the Hudson Valley, and the Finger Lakes. And we'll talk a lot about vinifera and which varieties in particular thrive in New York, and also discuss non-vinifera, because there is, in fact, a lot of it still planted, cultivated, and thriving in the state of New York. We'll talk briefly about experimental vineyards and research. We'll look at some production numbers and growth patterns in New York. We'll talk about the AVA system in New York, and I suspect there will be more AVAs and sub-AVAs to come. We'll discuss terroir characteristics and some wine styles of New York, including the most successful commercial categories. And we'll talk briefly about population density and the role it plays in the commercial success of New York wines. So there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm looking forward to it. I like to start this presentation with just a quick glimpse at the USA. Of course, all of you will do your projects and presentations on a specific state, but I'll just share with you a few fun facts before we get into New York. Here's a map of the continental USA, of course, and what I find just wonderful is that every state has commercial wineries in it now. Now, of course, not every state has very successful vineyards in it, but there are some measure of wine companies or businesses in absolutely every state, including, surprisingly, Alaska, Hawaii, Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and so on. So it's pretty exciting stuff, and it speaks volumes about consumption patterns and the popularity of wine growth in the United States. Just another map of the USA, and here is the emblem and map of New York, the great Empire State as it's known. And here, of course, is a county map of New York. And one thing I like county maps because they remind us how large states are organized. And then once we learn where wine regions are and we learn where AVAs are, we can see the overlap in counties and in AVAs. It's just another way to get a great grasp on the geography. This is a great simple map that shows you the dominant grape growing regions of New York. It's not an AVA map, although Long Island is an AVA, so is the Hudson River region, or Hudson River Valley, I should say, Finger Lakes. But all of those colored areas are where vineyards lie in New York. So there are huge amounts of vineyards planted in New York, and perhaps some of you are in New York, perhaps some of you have visited some of the more well-known regions and the regions near the population density of New York, perhaps on Long Island or the Hudson River Valley or even the Finger Lakes, which is by far the largest growing region. And the smaller regions on the west, the Lake Erie region, the Niagara Escarpment, and the Thousand Island region, those are regions not necessarily known for quality. Those are where a lot of the more bulk fruit vineyards lie, fruit and juice vineyards, and non-vinifera vineyards, although there's also non-vinifera around the state. But those regions are also where some of the experimental vineyards are, And as I said, a lot of non-wine vineyards, fruit and juice plants. Okay, here's another great map, just pointing out the primary regions and worded a little bit differently. But it's a county map. It also shows you the major bodies of water, including the mighty Hudson River and the lakes, Great Lakes region to the north and west. Okay, I like to just jump right in here and share with you, I'm sure you read in your atlases, that today there are 10 AVAs in the state of New York. So that does not seem like many compared to California, but I suspect that we will see more coming, sub-AVAs and individual AVAs in coming years. So I'll refer to the AVAs more than once, and some, of course, are sub-AVAs of other AVAs, and I think there's more explicit slides on those. Okay, moving on here. So let's see, a few fun facts about New York. Of course, it's called the Empire State. It has a rich history of wine production from the earliest settlers to modern day. From even the 1700s, people were producing fruit, juice, and wine in New York. And part of the history that's so fascinating that I'm sure you read, I'll just briefly remind you, is that some of the earliest settlers, homesteaders, people moving west across New York, they came across a lot of non-vinifera that was already there. And so it aligns with the kind of larger eastern seaboard wine history of people finding non-vinifera, people trying to cultivate and plant vinifera with uniform failure, and then a lot of innovation followed, including hybridizations and crosses made to both withstand the climate challenges of grape growing in New York and also other diseases, pests, and viruses that crept up in a place where there is higher humidity. So there's a lot of history in the state of New York that is amplified by the marginal and challenging grape growing conditions. And it speaks to the innovation of human beings that were determined to make wine, and for consumption reasons, enjoyment reasons, religious and sacramental reasons, and it's all linked together. And to me, it's very, very interesting. So it is a huge state with large and varied terrains, of course, climates and soil types. Largely region 1 and 2 on the heat summation scale. It's a cool place. It's cool. I know the summers can be hot and humid, but you also have diurnal shift, and you also have major cooling influences from the big bodies of water. There are going on 500 wineries in New York, which has been a big increase in the last, I'd say, 10 to 15 years in particular. And we will talk about some of that growth in a little bit here. So here's another great map of New York. I know it's smaller, but it really shows you the topography of New York State. A little bit more about the history here. Wine made as early as the 1600s by the Dutch Huguenots, and then of course 1800s by many, many other groups. I mentioned earlier that there were a lot of native and indigenous varieties in New York, that some made acceptable fruit, juice, and wine, and some did not taste so good. So vinifera, as I said, had this this largely uniform failure until as recently as the 1950s, when a Ukrainian viticulturalist named Konstantin Frank planted and experimented with vinifera. There had been some vinifera, I'm sure you read, in New York, but it really did not work. It failed. It did not make great wines. It really became susceptible to many of the perils that challenge viticulture in New York State. So when Dr. Frank planted and experimented with vinifera, he was a true believer, and he was very keen to adapt vinifera to the conditions and terroir conditions of New York State. And today, his winery, I think his granddaughter is running it now, and they're really considered one of the originals in New York, and still making great wines and lots of vinifera. And of course, many dozens of other wineries have followed. One of the research and experimental stations and organizations is at Cornell University in Geneva, and they have a huge property of experimental vineyards where they grow vinifera, they grow native varieties, they grow crosses and hybrids, and they study them and in their big viticultural program and part of their agricultural work. And it's really in service to the state of New York and to viticulturalists all over the world, in fact. And there's a great relationship with Canada. There's a great relationship with other viticultural and enology universities like UC Davis and Geisenheim, which is one of the great wine and viticultural schools in Germany, and with the University of Bordeaux in France. So it's really an amazing research organization, and they've done a lot, especially for the state of New York, in helping to determine which grapes are commercially that are commercially successful and work in the farming in New York. One last important part of the New York historical fabric is very recent history, and this was in 2011 when New Yorkers voted in what's fondly referred to as the Fine Wine Law, and this is a law that just opened up more business opportunities for wine companies and wineries, and this is just abbreviated here. You can look it up, and there's a lot of detail about this law, but essentially it made space for more tasting rooms. It made it easier with licensure and zoning so that New York could open more tasting rooms for consumers to taste and purchase. They opened up direct shipping, which is monumentally helpful to wineries so that they can sell directly to consumers. And they also opened up more space and laws around custom crush facilities. So that in turn created more wineries. In fact, all of these bylaws created more opportunities for wineries across New York. And that's why we've seen this growth in the last decade or so in the state of New York, which has been great. We've gone from essentially in the last 10 to 12 years, everyone, the number of wineries has doubled in New York. Now, of course, the pandemic has had some negative impact, but prior to the pandemic, the growth trajectory was very promising. And I remember when New York just 10 to 15 years ago had 250 to 300 wineries, and today, a decade later, there are nearly 500 wineries, as you know. So it's very exciting for the state It's exciting for the producers, it's exciting for consumers, and as I also referred to earlier, you have the population density to support the development, the growth, and the production levels. So it's an exciting time for New York. Here's some more fun facts about New York's growth, everyone. You can see that it's a very valuable industry, generating $6.65 billion in the industry, over 80,000 jobs, 470 wineries, third largest producer after California and Washington State. And this is very interesting. You have about 35,000 acres planted across this large state. 11,000 of them are by design meant for wine, and the rest, very interestingly, is meant for juice. So actually I should say fruit and juice and jelly. So you have huge companies like Welch's that farm an immense amount of fruit for juice, fruit, and jelly. Of course, they get fruit from California as well, but it's really an interesting fact around New York. And what it communicates to me is that these 11,000 acres for wine are really increasingly directed towards quality. And what's also interesting about that is the mix of vinifera and non-vinifera. There is far more non-vinifera throughout the state of New York than there is vinifera. So you have roughly 20% of New York vineyards planted to vinifera and approximately 80% to non-vinifera. So that speaks a lot to, again, the fruit, juice, and jelly industries. And by far the two most planted non-vinifera grapes are Concord. I'm sure you've maybe had Welch's Concord juice or jelly, and another grape called Catawba. And maybe some of you have seen it out there. I'm not sure if you're in New York. It is cultivated quite a bit in the Finger Lakes, and it's an interesting wine. You can find dry and off-dry styles, and some people are true believers and proponents of Catawba, and it's out there. So let me know if you find one or taste one. Okay, moving on. Here's examples, everyone, of some of the non-vinifera grapes cultivated in New York. So there's the Catawba, Delaware, Niagara, Isabella. These are all American hybrids. They are non-vinifera, non-European varieties crossed to make a hybrid that will grow and be successful in the climate and terroir of New York. The French hybrids, as you know, are crossed with European grapes. Excuse me. On that list, I've actually tried all of those wines. I've tried all of the wines on the sheet, but the French hybrids are often the most promising. And you have things like Sauvage Blanc and Vidal that are particularly successful in the Finger Lakes and can make both dry styles and are grapes that are very successful when infected with botrytis and can make really, really rewarding sweet wines as well. So again, let me know if you try any of these interesting non-vinifera wines out there. And let's talk about geography now. So I'll move on. Here are some examples of vinifera grapes that do well in New York. Of course, you have some real classics there in the white variety category, and some grapes you all know in the red category as well. But in general, I like to highlight that Chardonnay, there's a lot of Chardonnay planted in eastern New York. There's more in the Hudson Valley and on Long Island. And the Finger Lakes are a little bit more known for those aromatic varieties now, the Riesling especially, Pinot Gris, Pinot Blanc, Gewürztraminer. And so, although there is, in fact, Chardonnay, of course, in the Finger Lakes and elsewhere, I think some of the best examples are shining through from the eastern side of the state. There's also a lot of Bordeaux varieties on the eastern side of the state, and more Pinot Noir in the Finger Lakes, although I would argue that today there's some incredibly exciting Cabernet Franc coming out of the Finger Lakes. And in your kits, you'll taste a great example of a Finger Lakes Riesling. And I would just add quickly here, I think I might have mentioned it in the framing video, that if I could, I would have tried to send everyone a case of New York wine. I'm so excited about it. But in the program, of course, we have to stick to the major players. And that's why you'll taste a Finger Lakes dry Riesling in this module, and I'll be keen to know what you think of it. All right, now I'll move on and talk about some geography. AVAs of Eastern New York, and of course you have the Hudson River region, most often simply called the Hudson River Valley, but the proper AVA name is called the Hudson River region. The Upper Hudson is a sub-AVA. And then you have the Long Island AVAs, the Long Island umbrella AVA, if you will, North Fork of Long Island, and Hamptons Long Island. So I think the Hamptons, of course, are an exciting place. There's population density. There is a demographic to support the wine industry there, and a lot of pride around the local vineyards. So I think that even though it's not a huge region, I think we will in time see more sub-AVAs eventually on Long Island. I'll show you another map here. Oh, here's just a fun, simple map you can see maybe more closely on your own monitors. And here's another map from VinePair that I just think is fun because it has some of the major player wineries as well as some of the restaurants and things like that on the North Fork. So it's really not a huge area, the North Fork and the Hamptons even smaller, but there's some very, very dedicated viticulturalists and winemakers there. And as I said, I think we'll see increasing quality and increasing representation of these wines all over, not just in New York City and New York State alone, but in other places as well. It is very challenging to grow grapes on Long Island. I've visited a few times and talked to a lot of producers, and they share their challenges openly. Things like a lot of rain, high humidity, sometimes intense heat and sunburning of vineyards. So there's challenges that need to be met. And yet there's some very interesting maritime climate and some very, very interesting maritime soils that in certain areas vines really thrive. So the other last thing I'll say about the Long Island vineyards is that you do tend to see more vinifera planted on Long Island than other regions. And I think that also speaks to the commercial success of vinifera and the clientele and demand for vinifera wines in a place like Long Island. Okay, so we'll move on to the Finger Lakes now. There's a little map of the Finger Lakes, but you can see these, they call it the Finger Lakes for obvious reasons. They're long and narrow like fingers, and you can see them nestled sort of between cities of Syracuse, Ithaca, Rochester, in central and northern New York. So, of course, the state is huge. This looks like just a little bit of a review here. 20% of the grapes planted to vinifera. 90% of the wine produced in New York is made in the Finger Lakes. Now, I'd just like to be really clear that that's a huge number for New York. It shows us really how small the Hudson River region and Long Island are comparatively, but it also speaks to the fact that the vineyards to the north and the west are really vineyards for fruit and juice rather than wine. So the wine, the bulk of the wine, quality wine, vinifera wine, and non-vinifera wine are all made in the Finger Lakes. So the lakes are a very exciting region. I think that you can simply say that the lakes create this mitigating effect of the extremely cold weather in northern and central New York. And what's interesting about that is that the lakes can really impact the ground and kind of human level of climate and weather patterns in the Finger Lakes. So you can see that the lakes can help warm the weather in the spring when it's needed the most, right? Drawing in cold air and molecules, and in other words, really protecting these the bud break and the emergence of dormant vines. So that's a huge part of the terroir of the Finger Lakes. So these lakes, of course, were created by glaciers millions of years ago, and it's a terroir that's dominated by these lakes. And there are 11 lakes in total. There's really 5 or 6 that are the largest and kind of dominate the wine region of the Finger Lakes. But nearly 10,000 acres of those 11,000 acres of vines planted for wine. Riesling is a signature varietal for white, both dry, off-dry, sweet styles. I would add other aromatic whites are thriving. And of course, there's Burgundian varietals. There's Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. There's sparkling wine made out of Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and other grapes like Pinot Blanc. And there's also non-vinifera. So if and when, and I hope you do, visit the Finger Lakes, I think you'll find yourself in tasting rooms that offer exclusively vinifera, that offer exclusively non-vinifera, and many that offer both. So it's really the place in the USA that's working with both. Other states are as well, but New York in higher volume. We talked about the climate. The lakes pull in the cold air from the land and warming from the land, and the air, and can warm the vineyards when needed the most in the springtime especially, and then they can also help cool the vineyards in the summer when it is particularly hot. So there's this kind of give and take and this balancing act around the lakes in terms of climate that many producers argue is one of the great terroir attributes and characteristics of the Finger Lakes region. So a lot of small producers, won't surprise us. And here are the AVAs of the Finger Lakes. So in 1982, pretty early on in the AVA system, the first AVA was awarded. That's what I call the umbrella AVA of the Finger Lakes. And then you have Cayuga Lake in 1988 and Seneca Lake in 2003. So we'll see if there are more sub-AVAs in the pipeline, if you will, for New York, and I suspect there will be soon enough. This is just a fun map of the kind of 5 major lakes where the vineyards surround, and you can see the depth of the lakes and sort of the elevation of the hills surrounding the lakes. And it's an incredibly beautiful place, everyone. And I hope you'll all get there if you haven't already. Check it out, because it's an exciting region, as I've already stated more than once. So moving on, here's a neat satellite map of the Finger Lakes, and you can check that out just for fun. Here's a great map of the wineries. It's kind of the wine trail map, and it's just magnificent. It's so great that this region is finally getting some of the recognition it deserves. And of course, they have a booming tourism industry there with lots of activities, from wine tasting and restauranting to boating and lake activities and camping and the great outdoors life. So there's a lot of attraction there. And I know the region was hit pretty hard by the pandemic, like we all were, but it's nice to know that the Finger Lakes is finally getting the recognition it deserves for its wines. And if you look closely at this map, you can find some of the more historic wineries that you read about in your atlas, and like you can find Constant and Frank. You can find the Herman Weimer winery, which is kind of in the central western side of Seneca Lake. You can find some of the more historic and also newer wineries when you look at maps like this and plan a route. So just for fun, I like to point that out. Great. Here's a picture looking across the southern part of Seneca Lake. You can see the vineyard there. It looks a little bit scrawny. I say that respectfully, but it's both a young vineyard and also a vineyard growing in a marginal climate. So they don't have the vigor and growth that you see in plants growing in more fertile soils and more sunny climates. So they don't all look quite so small, but certainly it is a land of small producers, small vineyards, small plants, and increasingly better wine. Okay, everybody, I'll wrap this up. Here is another map of New York with some of the AVAs listed. Here's your AVA list again, just to be sure. Didn't really talk too much about the Western AVAs. I mentioned them briefly at the beginning. You do have non-vinifera and some vinifera planted in those areas, and not huge production yet. We'll see what comes online for Niagara Escarpment and Champlain Valley. But the others, I would say almost all the others, are rapidly gaining recognition and producing some fantastic wines. All right, everyone, there's our presentation and overview of the great state of New York, and hope you're all doing well. I'll leave you with a last quote here, and look forward to reading your comments about New York, vinifera and non-vinifera, and seeing your tasting notes. So stay well, and I look forward to hearing from you. Here's our last quote. Anne Fairbairn: "There must always be wine and fellowship, or we are truly lost." I agree.